an earlier video on my 190E, I went over a list of all the things that were wrong with this car when I purchased it. Some of the things I've already fixed. Look at here, I've got a brand new hood pad. I've repaired a number of the easier things like the power antenna now works. And just last week, I finally finished repairing the power tilting sunroof. Now this was a real challenge. And I ended up filming over 2 hours of video on how to remove the roof, repair the mechanism, work on the motor, change the cable, and the whole process is now going to be available as a video manual. And it will be released on my new website this fall as a download. Now there's one other thing that I mentioned that's been plaguing me, and that is the fact that the engine, when it starts, it will start, run rough, then quit, then restart. This is very typical of a lot of 4- and 6-cylinder gas engines that Mercedes produced through the mid-80s to the mid-90s. And on this 2.6 engine, it happened almost every morning. Some mornings it would start and just barely run, and you'd have to let it warm up a little bit, and then it would run fine. So I was anticipating having to do a full-blown video on how to deal with the fuel injection system on this car, because I really thought it was probably an injection issue. But wait until you find out what the problem was. This is going to be one short video. At the same time I was having the start problem, I was also having a battery problem. Sometimes I'd let the car sit for a week or 2 weeks, and there was nothing in the battery. I couldn't get the car started, or just crank. So I knew the battery was old, so I went out and purchased a brand new Bosch battery and installed it. And as soon as I installed that new battery, guess what? The car started up and ran right up to 1200 RPM, ran smoothly, no hesitation, no cough. And that is when I began to think that maybe this is an electrical problem rather than a fuel issue. So the first thing I did was I replaced the overvoltage protection relay, thinking that that could be the problem, and it didn't make any difference. But the other day, while working on this car, I said, I got to find out the reason. Even with a new battery in, I'd let the car sit and the battery would go dead. So I thought, no, it can't be the battery. So guess what it was? Yep, my favorite, the voltage regulator. Now, in all the years that I've owned and driven Mercedes-Benz, there has been only one time that I have been stranded on the open road, and that was because of the failure of a voltage regulator. But take a close look at this one. When we pulled it out of the alternator, we were absolutely shocked. One of the brushes was worn down to a nib. And this appeared to be a fairly new regulator, so my suspicion was that this was probably broken when the voltage regulator was installed. And it was just barely making contact on one brush. The interesting thing was I was not getting any warning lights on the dash. All the dash lights were working properly, except every once in a while the ABS light would come on. That was kind of giving me another clue. But as soon as we installed a brand new regulator, and this is what they should look like, you can see the difference here. We had to start it a few times, kind of let those brushes wear in, and now when I start the car, she just fires right up, goes right up to high idle, and then as it warms up, it just drops back down to the proper RPM. And I am really happy about this, because this is another example of one of those really easy repairs that only going to cost you $20 to $30. Let me show you how this voltage regulator fits in the back of an alternator, and possibly the reason why it was broken in the first place. I'm holding a typical alternator here that's from an older Mercedes. They're very similar all the way from the late 70s up to the early 90s. The voltage regulator fits on the back side, and it's either accessible from the top side or underneath the car. In the 190E, it was easier to take and get under the car and remove the screws and pull the regulator out that way. Note here that in order to install it, you have to put the voltage regulator in at an angle and then get it down in here, get it into position, and it is spring loaded, and then you push down and install 2 screws here. If you force this in like that and get one of the brushes caught on one of the ridges on the commutator, you can tighten these screws down and you can damage that lower brush. When we sell a regulator, we include a special strap that allows you to open these up so that when you install it, that will prevent damaging that lower brush. So we successfully installed this in the 190E, and now not only are we getting a good strong battery, but guess what? That ABS light has failed to come back on. I just love easy and inexpensive fixes to big problems. And this was a big problem, and it was annoying. And the fact that it only cost me about $25 was like icing on the cake. And you're probably wondering, well, how could low or no alternator output raise havoc with an engine start problem? Well, let me explain in simple terms. You know, most of these gasoline cars from the mid-80s on have computer controls that regulate things like ignition and fuel flow to the injectors. And if you have low voltage to the computers or the ECUs, that low voltage can affect their operation. In some cases, the engine could go into what is called limp home mode and won't run properly. And that was probably the case with my 190E. So by restoring strong voltage output from the alternator to the battery, it suddenly woke up all those electrical components, and now the engine runs fine. Let me say one more thing about a voltage regulator. I carry these now in the trunk in all my cars along with the tools to change them. And about 3 years ago, the second time I got stranded, but I'm not going to say stranded because I really just kept going, was when I was driving my 300 CE in Eastern Washington. I was going down the road about 40 miles an hour, and all of a sudden all the lights, all the warning lights on the dash came on and started blinking. And I got this big smile on my face because immediately I knew what the problem was, and I knew I had it in the trunk and I had the tools to change it. And I quickly pulled into this old car parts lot, got out, started changing the regulator right there in the parking lot. You should have seen these guys come out from the store and they say, "What are you doing?" I'm explaining to them, you know, they're just shaking their head and walking back in the store. But within 10 minutes, I had that car running again and I was on my way. So you see, I didn't get stranded. So I'm going to recommend that you also inspect your voltage regulator, take a look at it. If those brushes are worn down, replace it. You sometimes cannot tell visually if it's working or not. You'll need to get it tested properly, and you can do that at most auto parts stores. But if there's any reason you think that regulator should be changed, just change it, because I've seen so many people stranded on the open road because of the failure of this simple part. And that's why I call it the best run insurance. Okay.